So today, I want to talk about something that I believe is the most important economic story unfolding right now, and it is not the story you are hearing about in the news. You turn on the television or scroll through your social media feed, and all you see is endless, frantic speculation about geopolitical tensions, military posturing, and the looming, terrifying threat of an impending war. But while the entire world is completely distracted by the possibility of military conflict, there is a silent, creeping devastation happening right beneath the surface that is fundamentally reshaping the global economy as we know it. What we are witnessing is the absolute collapse of the Chinese economic miracle. And it is a disaster so profound, so immense, and so structurally dangerous that it will inevitably impact every single person watching this video today. Ray Dalio has been warning about this exact scenario for months, pointing to a perfect storm of converging crises that are destroying wealth at a terrifying and unprecedented scale. This is not a temporary blip, a minor recession, or a standard cyclical downturn that will resolve itself in a few quarters. This is a massive, uncontrollable economic evaporation that is happening in real time right before our eyes, and the mainstream media is completely missing the real story. The absolute truth is that China is currently drowning in a sea of its own making, facing a brutal reality where four simultaneous structural crises are colliding with immense force to create a catastrophic, inescapable doom loop. If you have money invested in the markets, if you buy standard consumer goods, or if you simply care deeply about your personal economic future in an increasingly volatile world, you desperately need to understand what is happening right now. We are talking about the complete destruction of an entire economic growth model that has artificially powered the world for the last 4 decades. To truly grasp the unbelievable magnitude of this threat, we have to look far past the geopolitical noise and meticulously break down the 4 foundational pillars of this collapse, starting with the single most irreversible force of all. The first major crisis unfolding in China right now is a demographic collapse of truly epic historical proportions. For decades, China's greatest economic asset, the very foundation of its explosive growth, was its endless, massive supply of cheap young labor. This massive, vibrant workforce allowed them to rapidly become the undisputed factory of the world, producing goods at prices literally no one else on the planet could match and generating absolutely unprecedented global trade surpluses. But that immense demographic dividend has now completely vanished into thin air. Because of the brutal, lingering long-term effects of the one-child policy and a rapidly declining modern birth rate, China's overall population is now actively shrinking at a terrifying pace. We are not just talking about a slight temporary dip in numbers. We are looking at a permanent structural population decline where the core working-age demographic is literally evaporating while the dependent elderly population is exploding beyond the state's capacity to manage. This means there are dramatically fewer young people available to work in the factories, fewer young people to buy new homes, fewer young people to start families, and an enormous, crushing, ever-growing financial burden placed on the state and the rapidly shrinking workforce to somehow support a massive aging population. The immense deflationary pressure caused directly by this unprecedented demographic shift is absolutely staggering to witness. When your population shrinks, your domestic demand permanently and irreversibly contracts. You simply cannot stimulate your way out of a severe demographic collapse. You cannot digitally print new, productive young workers to fill empty factories. This means the foundational engine of China's domestic consumer growth is broken forever, leading directly to a long-term economic stagnation that absolutely terrifies global investors and economists alike. This demographic nightmare is the structural bedrock of the current crisis, but it is deeply, inextricably intertwined with the second, arguably much more immediate disaster, which brings us to the second crisis, the absolute total destruction of the Chinese property market. For the past 20 years, real estate was the ultimate guaranteed wealth builder in China. It accounted for nearly 30% of their entire gross domestic product, a staggering figure that highlights its systemic importance. It was the absolute primary vehicle for wealth storage and savings for millions upon millions of ordinary, hardworking citizens who truly believed that property prices would only ever go up. But that massive debt-fueled bubble has now spectacularly and violently burst. We are currently seeing massive, untouchable major developers aggressively defaulting on their massive debts. Thousands of massive construction projects completely abandoned and left to rot, and immense, unimaginable amounts of household wealth completely evaporating literally overnight. Millions of regular people poured their entire life savings into unbuilt apartments that will never, ever be finished. And those who actually do own finished homes are helplessly watching their hard-earned equity be completely destroyed as market prices precipitously plummet into the abyss. This is not just a standard housing correction or a minor market adjustment. It is a fundamental, deeply traumatic wealth destruction event that is violently wiping out the financial security of the entire Chinese middle class. The deep psychological trauma of this massive property collapse literally cannot be overstated. Imagine working your entire adult life, painfully saving every single penny you earn, and putting absolutely all of it into a concrete box in the sky that suddenly loses half its value or simply ceases to exist entirely because the developer went bankrupt. That is the brutal, unforgiving reality for countless millions of Chinese citizens right now. They are currently suffering immense, agonizing financial pain, and as their perceived wealth suddenly evaporates, their willingness to spend money in the broader economy completely vanishes with it. If you are finding this analysis useful, make sure you subscribe because I'm going to keep breaking down these global economic shifts in simple English every single week. Now, as the demographic foundation violently crumbles and the property market completely evaporates, it directly triggers a catastrophic, widespread psychological shift among the populace, which leads us directly to the third deeply structural crisis, a total paralyzing collapse in both consumer and business confidence, resulting in a severe, inescapable balance sheet recession. When ordinary people are absolutely afraid for their financial future, when they see their absolute primary source of wealth violently destroyed in front of their eyes, they completely stop spending money and start aggressively hoarding cash to protect themselves. This is exactly what is happening across the entirety of China right now. Ordinary, everyday citizens are absolutely terrified. They are deliberately choosing to aggressively pay down their existing debt rather than buy any new consumer goods. Businesses, seeing this massive, unprecedented collapse in domestic consumer demand, are flatly refusing to invest in new projects or expand their operations. They are aggressively deleveraging, prioritizing absolute baseline survival over any form of future growth. This is the absolute textbook definition of a severe balance sheet recession, a terrifying, suffocating economic trap where no matter how much the central bank desperately tries to stimulate the broader economy by drastically lowering interest rates, absolutely nobody wants to borrow a single cent. People are desperately, frantically trying to repair their utterly destroyed personal balance sheets, and as a direct result, money completely stops moving through the domestic economy. This creates massive, unstoppable deflationary pressure across every sector. Prices violently fall, corporate profits massively shrink, worker wages are ruthlessly slashed, and the agonizing cycle of economic despair rapidly deepens. It is a pathetic, agonizing downward spiral where the harder the central government desperately tries to push new money into the financial system, the more the terrified citizens aggressively hoard it out of pure, unadulterated economic fear. The Chinese consumer, once heralded as the great unstoppable hope for infinite global corporate profits, is now violently struggling just to stay afloat, actively drowning in a deep sea of immense pessimism and crushing economic anxiety. This severe structural lack of confidence completely paralyzes the domestic market and massively exacerbates the severe overcapacity problem, as massive Chinese factories stubbornly continue to produce endless goods that absolutely nobody at home can actually afford to buy, forcing these desperate companies to aggressively dump these excess products on the global market at absolute rock bottom, deflationary prices. But the truly terrifying nightmare does not end there, because this total, suffocating economic paralysis feeds directly into the fourth and final, devastating pillar of this disaster: massive systemic fiscal decay and the rapidly looming catastrophic failure of the entire local banking system. In China, local regional governments relied heavily, almost exclusively, on selling massive plots of land to eager real estate developers to fund their massive operating budgets. It was a massive, completely debt-fueled Ponzi scheme that worked absolutely brilliantly as long as property prices kept artificially rising forever. But with the massive property market now completely destroyed, local government funding revenues have absolutely and totally collapsed. They are now deeply buried under literal mountains of hidden, unpayable debt, violently struggling to pay for even the most basic civic services, let alone fund the massive, wasteful infrastructure projects that they use to artificially boost their regional GDP numbers. To forcibly prevent a total, catastrophic, systemic collapse of the entire nation, Beijing is currently being forced to orchestrate absolutely enormous, unprecedented capital injections directly into the financial system, desperately trying to aggressively plug the massive, bleeding holes in a rapidly deteriorating, fragile banking sector. Regional local banks, which eagerly lent heavily to both the now failed mega developers and the heavily indebted bankrupt local municipalities, are currently sitting on massive toxic piles of completely bad loans that will never be repaid. The deep fiscal decay is rapidly spreading like a vicious, unstoppable cancer through the entire interconnected financial architecture of the entire country. The central government is completely caught in an absolutely impossible, unwinnable bind. If they simply let these bankrupt local governments and over-leveraged regional banks naturally fail, it will instantly trigger a catastrophic, widespread financial panic, the likes of which we have never seen. If they actively bail them out with massive, endless capital injections, they severely risk further exacerbating the massive deflationary spiral and completely destroying the international value of their own currency. It is a structurally unwinnable, absolutely terrifying situation. So let me now bring absolutely all four of these massive crises together to clearly show you the true terrifying magnitude of this global danger. We have an irreversible, unstoppable demographic collapse actively destroying all long-term domestic demand. We have a violently evaporating property market aggressively wiping out decades of accumulated generational wealth. We have a severe, suffocating balance sheet recession directly driven by a total, absolute collapse in nationwide confidence. And we have deep systemic fiscal decay actively rotting the entire banking system directly from the inside out. These four massive, terrifying crises are absolutely not happening in isolation. They are rapidly converging simultaneously, violently feeding off one another in a devastating, inescapable doom loop. When property values violently fall, local government revenues completely crash. When local governments aggressively slash their spending, local businesses deeply suffer and forcefully lay off their workers. When regular workers lose their jobs or see their wages brutally cut, they completely stop spending money, which dramatically deepens the severe balance sheet recession. And as the overall population continues to aggressively shrink, the mathematical fundamental possibility of ever actually growing out of this massive, suffocating debt burden becomes completely and utterly impossible. This is the terrifying, unvarnished reality that Ray Dalio has been aggressively highlighting to anyone who will listen. We are actively watching the real-time, violent implosion of a massive economic superpower. If this deeply depressing scenario sounds familiar to you, it absolutely should. Many top economists are actively comparing China's current terrifying predicament to Japan's infamous agonizing lost decade in the 1990s, when a massive debt-fueled real estate and stock market bubble spectacularly burst, abruptly plunging the entire country into many long years of severe deflation and deep economic stagnation. But there is a crucial, absolutely terrifying fundamental difference between Japan back then and China right now. When Japan's massive bubble finally burst, they were actually already a highly developed, incredibly wealthy nation with a very high per capita income. They could mathematically afford to slowly endure a painful lost decade. China, on the other hand, is rapidly growing incredibly old long before it actually grows rich. The average, everyday Chinese citizen absolutely does not have the massive protective social safety net or the deeply accumulated generational wealth that the Japanese citizens actually had. Furthermore, the sheer, unimaginable scale of the massive Chinese economy makes this infinitely more dangerous for the entire rest of the interconnected world. China has been the absolute primary, unstoppable engine of massive global economic growth for the entire 21st century. Absolutely no other country on earth, not India, not the United States, absolutely not anyone, can simply step in and quickly replace the sheer unbelievable volume of global production and massive consumption that China consistently provided. As China's domestic economy rapidly and painfully stagnates, they are currently frantically trying to aggressively export their way out of the massive crisis by heavily dumping cheap, heavily subsidized goods directly onto the fragile global market. While this desperate strategy might temporarily lower short-term inflation for some Western consumers, it is actively violently destroying vital manufacturing industries in countless other countries, leading directly to a massive, dangerous spike in global protectionism and aggressive trade wars. The interconnected world is simply structurally unequipped to safely handle a structurally declining, desperate China. The broader geopolitical implications of this massive collapse are also deeply, profoundly alarming. Historically, when powerful authoritarian regimes face severe, completely unsolvable domestic economic crises, they very often aggressively look for massive external distractions to artificially unify the angry populace. The deep fear of a violent military conflict is absolutely real, but it is merely a dangerous symptom of this massive underlying economic decay, not the actual root cause itself. The true undeniable danger is that the entire global economy is rapidly losing its absolute biggest growth engine at a time when massive global debt is at terrifying record highs, and major Western economies are facing their own deeply significant structural headwinds. The golden era of endless abundant cheap labor, limitless cheap consumer goods, and completely uninterrupted global growth directly driven by massive Chinese economic expansion is absolutely and completely over forever. We are actively entering a new, much darker, and far more dangerous global economic paradigm. You absolutely have to understand right now that this is not just a distant, irrelevant problem quietly happening on the exact other side of the world. This is a profound, massive tectonic shift that will violently reshape all global supply chains, massively alter the future trajectory of all global inflation, and fundamentally, permanently change the entire global investment landscape for the next entire decade. If you are currently holding any assets that deeply rely on endless Chinese growth, you are currently exposed to immense, terrifying financial risk. The massive, unprecedented wealth destruction currently happening inside China will absolutely and inevitably violently spill over into all global financial markets. Major international companies that heavily relied on the massive Chinese consumer base are going to see their future revenues absolutely and totally decimated. The massive deflationary waves aggressively radiating outward from China will deeply impact future interest rate decisions, massive corporate earnings, and ultimately, the total value of your own personal financial portfolio. We are actively witnessing the violent, messy end of a massive economic era, and the painful transition into this completely new, uncertain reality is going to be incredibly brutal and deeply painful for everyone involved. You absolutely cannot afford to naively ignore this massive shift. You cannot afford to be easily distracted by the shallow, surface-level daily news cycle while the massive underlying tectonic plates of the entire global economy are shifting so violently and permanently beneath your feet. The massive simultaneous convergence of severe demographic collapse, violent property destruction, total confidence evaporation, and deep fiscal decay has forcefully created a massive economic black hole that is slowly, inevitably sucking the life and momentum out of the entire global economy. Every single major economic metric we closely look at strongly points to a very long, deeply grueling, and painful period of severe stagnation and massive deleveraging. The ordinary citizens of China are currently facing a deeply tragic, heartbreaking reality, completely trapped in a rigid system that falsely promised them endless, uninterrupted prosperity, but is now actively delivering absolutely nothing but completely broken dreams and severe financial ruin. And as their massive economic miracle violently unravels before our eyes, the massive destructive shockwaves will absolutely be felt in every single corner of the globe. From the volatile price of basic global commodities to the underlying stability of massive Western financial institutions, this is the absolute, real, undeniable crisis. This is the massive structural danger that aggressively threatens to forcefully drag the entire world into a prolonged, painful period of deep economic darkness. You absolutely must actively prepare yourself right now for a new, volatile world where the old, reliable rules of global growth absolutely no longer apply. You must aggressively safeguard your personal wealth against the massive, unstoppable deflationary pressures and the severe geopolitical instability that will absolutely and inevitably follow this massive economic collapse. The quiet time for foolish complacency is absolutely and completely over. The terrifying writing is clearly on the wall, and the massive, undeniable numbers absolutely do not lie. We are actively watching major world history forcefully unfold right now, and it is a dark history permanently defined by the brutal, unwinding collapse of the absolute greatest debt and real estate bubble the entire world has ever seen. Subscribe for more analysis, because understanding these massive macro forces is the absolute only way to successfully protect yourself in this rapidly changing, highly dangerous environment. And tell me in the comments, do you think China can escape its lost decade, or is the structural damage already too deep?